Sarah Martinez had always been proud of her decision to serve her country. At 22, she enlisted in the Marines with dreams of making a difference and proving that she could handle anything the military threw at her. Standing at 5'4" with determination burning in her dark eyes, she completed boot camp with honors and was assigned to a forward operating base in Afghanistan as a communications specialist. The explosion happened on a Tuesday morning during what should have been a routine convoy mission. Sarah was riding in the second vehicle when an improvised explosive device detonated beneath their Humvee. The blast threw her 20 feet from the vehicle, and when she regained consciousness 3 days later in a military hospital in Germany, half of her face and her left arm were covered in angry red scars that would never fully fade. The physical therapy was grueling, but Sarah pushed through every session with the same determination that had gotten her through boot camp. The doctors said she was lucky to be alive, and she knew they were right. Her left eye had been saved, though her vision was permanently impaired. The scars stretched from her temple down to her jaw, creating a map of raised, discolored skin that she would carry for the rest of her life. When Sarah was finally cleared to return to duty 8 months later, she thought the hardest part was behind her. She had learned to adapt to her physical limitations, and had even grown to accept her appearance. The woman looking back at her in the mirror was different from the fresh-faced recruit who had enlisted, but she was a survivor, and that meant something. Her new assignment was at Camp Pendleton in California, working in the communications center. Sarah threw herself into her work, determined to prove that her injuries hadn't diminished her capabilities. She arrived early, stayed late, and volunteered for additional duties whenever possible. Her supervisors praised her dedication and technical skills, noting in her evaluations that she was one of the most reliable Marines in the unit. But not everyone was supportive of Sarah's return to active duty. A group of Marines from her unit, led by Sergeant Jake Morrison, seemed to take perverse pleasure in making comments about her appearance. It started small with whispered jokes when she walked by, and graduated to more overt harassment as the weeks went on. Morrison was a career Marine with 15 years of service and a reputation for being tough on subordinates. He had never deployed to a combat zone, having spent his entire career in training roles stateside. To him, Sarah's scars were a reminder of a reality he had never faced, and perhaps that made him uncomfortable, in ways he couldn't articulate. The comments began during morning formation when Morrison would make jokes about Halloween masks and horror movie extras, loud enough for Sarah and others to hear. His followers, a group of younger Marines who looked up to him, would laugh and add their own cruel observations. They called her Scarface and Two-Face, names that cut deeper than any physical wound ever could. Sarah tried to ignore the harassment at first, hoping it would stop if she didn't react. She had dealt with bullies before and knew that sometimes the best strategy was to refuse to give them the satisfaction of seeing her upset. She focused on her work, maintained her military bearing, and tried to find support among the other Marines in the unit, who treated her with respect. But Morrison and his group weren't content to let their harassment remain verbal. They began leaving printouts of scary movie characters on her desk and in her locker. Someone drew crude pictures depicting her face and posted them in the common areas where everyone would see them. The harassment escalated when they started making videos on their phones, pretending to be frightened when she walked into a room. The breaking point came during a unit barbecue on a Friday evening. Sarah had been looking forward to the event, hoping it would be an opportunity to bond with her fellow Marines in a more relaxed setting. She had even bought a new top for the occasion, something that made her feel confident despite her scars. Morrison had been drinking, which seemed to amplify his cruelty. When Sarah arrived at the barbecue, he loudly announced to everyone within earshot that they should hide the children because the monster had arrived. The laughter that followed was like a punch to her stomach, but Sarah forced herself to maintain her composure. Throughout the evening, Morrison and his followers continued their torment. They made jokes about her appearance whenever she was within earshot, speculated loudly about how she had gotten her scars, and even went so far as to suggest that she was lying about being injured in combat. The suggestion that she was somehow fabricating or exaggerating her service-connected injuries was particularly painful. Other Marines at the barbecue seemed uncomfortable with the harassment, but no one spoke up to defend Sarah. Some looked away when the comments started. Others found excuses to move to different areas of the party. The silence of the bystanders was almost as hurtful as the active harassment from Morrison's group. As the evening wore on, Sarah found herself standing alone near the edge of the gathering. watching her fellow Marines laugh and enjoy themselves while she felt increasingly isolated. She had survived an IED blast and months of painful recovery, but this social combat felt more brutal than anything she had faced on the battlefield. The harassment had taken a toll on Sarah's mental health, though she tried not to show it. She began experiencing anxiety attacks before coming to work each morning, wondering what new humiliation awaited her. Her sleep was disrupted by nightmares that mixed memories of the explosion with scenes of Morrison and his followers laughing at her. She found herself avoiding common areas and eating meals alone to minimize her exposure to their cruelty. Sarah knew she should report the harassment through official channels, but she was reluctant to be seen as someone who couldn't handle the rough culture of military life. She had worked so hard to prove herself as a capable Marine, and she worried that filing a complaint would make her appear weak or unable to cope with adversity. The weight of the harassment was becoming unbearable, but Sarah didn't know where to turn for help. Her family was supportive but lived across the country, and she hadn't formed close friendships with other Marines in the unit. She felt trapped in a situation where seeking help might damage her military career, but staying silent was destroying her emotional well-being. What Sarah didn't know was that her situation was about to change dramatically. Unbeknownst to her, a group of Navy SEAL veterans who worked as contractors on the base had been observing the harassment with growing disgust. These were men who understood the true meaning of brotherhood and honor, and what they were witnessing went against everything they believed in. The SEAL veterans had noticed Sarah's professionalism and dedication to her duties. They had also seen the toll that the constant harassment was taking on her, even though she tried to hide it. These were men who had served multiple combat deployments and understood the sacrifice that came with military service. To them, Sarah's scars were badges of honor, not objects of ridicule. Led by Master Chief Petty Officer, retired Marcus Thompson, the 12 SEAL veterans began quietly discussing what they had witnessed. Thompson was a 24-year veteran who had served in Iraq and Afghanistan, leading teams through some of the most dangerous missions of both conflicts. He was known for his integrity and his unwavering commitment to protecting those who couldn't protect themselves. The group included men with diverse backgrounds but shared values. There was Chief Petty Officer, retired David Chen, a communications expert who had worked closely with Marines in joint operations overseas. Petty Officer First Class, retired Roberto Sanchez, had been wounded twice in combat and understood the challenges of dealing with visible injuries. Senior Chief Petty Officer, retired, Michael O'Brien had lost teammates to IED attacks and respected anyone who had survived such an experience. As they watched Morrison and his followers continue their campaign of harassment against Sarah, the SEAL veterans felt a growing sense of anger and disgust. These were men who had sworn an oath to protect and defend, and seeing a fellow service member being tormented by her own unit members went against everything they stood for. Thompson and his team began developing a plan to address the situation. They knew that direct confrontation might escalate the problem or put Sarah in an even more difficult position. Instead, they decided to approach the situation with the same strategic thinking they had used in combat operations overseas. The first step was gathering intelligence about Morrison and his followers. The SEAL veterans used their connections and observation skills to learn everything they could about the Marines involved in the harassment. They discovered that Morrison had a history of bullying behavior that had been overlooked by his superiors, and that several of his followers were young Marines who might be influenced to change their behavior. Meanwhile, Sarah continued to endure the daily harassment, unaware that help was on the way. She had reached a point where she was considering requesting a transfer to another unit, even though it would likely hurt her military career. The emotional toll of the constant torment was becoming more than she could bear alone. The stage was set for a confrontation that would change everything for Sarah and teach Morrison and his followers a lesson they would never forget. The 12 SEAL veterans were about to demonstrate what real military brotherhood looked like, and their intervention would restore Sarah's faith in the honor and integrity that was supposed to define military service. As Sarah prepared for another difficult day at work, she had no idea that a group of elite warriors was planning to stand up for her in a way that would not only stop the harassment, but also show Morrison and his followers the true meaning of courage and honor. The battle lines were being drawn, and the SEALs were ready to fight for one of their own. The morning started like any other for Sarah. With the familiar knot of anxiety in her stomach, as she prepared for another day of facing Morrison and his followers. She had developed a routine of arriving at work 15 minutes early to minimize her interactions with the group, using the quiet time to prepare herself mentally for whatever harassment awaited her. As she walked across the base toward the communications center, Sarah noticed something different in the atmosphere. There seemed to be more activity than usual, with groups of people engaged in hushed conversations. She couldn't shake the feeling that something significant was about to happen, though she had no idea what it might be. Master Chief Thompson and his team had spent the weekend finalizing their plan. They had decided that their intervention needed to be public enough to send a clear message, but professional enough to avoid creating additional problems for Sarah. The SEALs understood that their actions would be scrutinized by military leadership, so everything they did needed to be above reproach. Thompson had reached out to his contacts in the base command structure, including Colonel Patricia Williams, the base commander. Williams was a no-nonsense officer who had risen through the ranks in a male-dominated military and had zero tolerance for harassment or discrimination. When Thompson briefed her on what they had observed, she was both outraged and grateful for the information. The colonel had been unaware of the harassment Sarah was enduring, as no formal complaints had been filed. She immediately ordered a discreet investigation into Morrison's conduct and authorized Thompson's team to proceed with their intervention, provided they followed military protocol and kept her informed of their actions. Meanwhile, Chief Chen had been conducting research into Morrison's background and discovered some troubling information. Morrison had been the subject of 2 previous informal complaints about harassment that had been quietly swept under the rug by his previous commanders. There were also indications that his behavior was part of a pattern that extended beyond just targeting Sarah. The SEAL team's plan was multifaceted and designed to address both the immediate harassment of Sarah and the broader culture that allowed such behavior to flourish. They would approach the situation from multiple angles, using their skills, connections, and moral authority to create lasting change. On Monday morning, the first phase of their plan went into action. Thompson approached Sarah during her lunch break, introducing himself and asking if he could speak with her privately. Sarah was surprised by the request but agreed, curious about why a senior SEAL would want to talk with her. Thompson was direct but respectful in his approach. He explained that he and his team had witnessed the harassment she was enduring and wanted her to know that she had allies on the base. He was careful not to make her feel like a victim or suggest that she couldn't handle the situation herself, instead framing their offer of support as one warrior looking out for another. Sarah was initially hesitant to accept help, worried that involving the SEALs might escalate the situation or make her appear unable to fight her own battles. Thompson understood her concerns and assured her that their intervention would be professional and measured. He emphasized that what Morrison and his followers were doing was not just wrong but also contrary to the values that military service was supposed to represent. The conversation was a turning point for Sarah. For the first time since the harassment began, she felt like someone truly understood what she was going through and was willing to stand with her. Thompson's respectful approach and obvious sincerity convinced her to trust the SEAL team's judgment. That afternoon, Senior Chief O'Brien put the second phase of their plan into motion. He approached several of the younger Marines in Morrison's group individually, engaging them in conversations about military service and brotherhood. O'Brien was skilled at reading people and quickly identified which of Morrison's followers were truly committed to the harassment and which were simply going along with the group. Private First Class Tyler Brooks was one of the Marines that O'Brien approached. Brooks was 19 years old and had joined Morrison's group more out of a desire to fit in than from any real malice towards Sarah. When O'Brien shared stories about wounded warriors he had served with and the respect they deserved, Brooks began to question his participation in the harassment. O'Brien didn't lecture or threaten Brooks. Instead, he told stories about Marines and SEALs who had been wounded in combat and how their injuries represented sacrifice and courage rather than weakness. He described the brotherhood that existed among warriors and how protecting and supporting each other was a fundamental part of that bond. By the end of their conversation, Brooks was clearly uncomfortable with his role in Morrison's campaign against Sarah. O'Brien could see the young Marine's conscience awakening, and he knew that at least one member of the harassment group might be turned away from Morrison's influence. Similar conversations were happening with other young Marines in Morrison's group. Chief Sanchez, who bore his own combat scars, was particularly effective at reaching Marines who might be susceptible to changing their behavior. He shared his own experiences with dealing with injuries and the importance of supporting fellow service members who had made sacrifices. While the SEALs were working to undermine Morrison's support base, they were also gathering evidence of the harassment. Petty Officer Second Class retired James Martinez, who worked in base security, had access to surveillance footage that showed some of Morrison's group placing harassing materials in Sarah's workspace. This evidence would be crucial if formal disciplinary action became necessary. The SEALs were also using their network of contacts to spread word about Morrison's behavior throughout the base. Military communities are tight-knit, and news of the harassment began reaching the ears of other senior enlisted personnel and officers who had the authority to take action. Thompson made a point of having casual conversations with Morrison's superiors, not to make formal accusations but to plant seeds of awareness about potential problems in their unit. He was careful to present himself as concerned about unit cohesion and morale, rather than making specific accusations, allowing the officers to draw their own conclusions. The pressure was beginning to build around Morrison, though he wasn't yet aware of the forces aligning against him. He continued his harassment of Sarah, perhaps even escalating it, as he sensed that something in the base atmosphere was changing but couldn't identify what it was. On Wednesday morning, Morrison made a critical mistake that would accelerate his downfall. During morning formation, he made a particularly cruel comment about Sarah's appearance, suggesting that she should wear a mask to avoid frightening other Marines. The comment was overheard by Captain Richard Hayes, a company commander who had recently returned from deployment. Captain Hayes had served 2 tours in Afghanistan and had lost Marines under his command to IED attacks. When he heard Morrison's comment about Sarah's combat-related scars, he was furious. Hayes immediately ordered Morrison to report to his office after formation, where he delivered a scathing rebuke about respect for wounded warriors. The captain's intervention was exactly what Thompson and his team had been hoping for. They had been working to create an environment where Morrison's behavior would no longer be tolerated, and Captain Hayes's reaction showed that their efforts were succeeding. That afternoon, Thompson decided it was time to directly confront Morrison. The SEAL approached Morrison in the base parking lot after duty hours, when there would be fewer witnesses but still enough people around to ensure the conversation remained professional. Thompson introduced himself to Morrison and calmly explained that he and his team had been observing the harassment of Sarah. He didn't threaten or intimidate Morrison but made it clear that the behavior needed to stop immediately. Thompson's tone was measured but carried the unmistakable authority of someone who had earned respect through years of dangerous service. Morrison's reaction revealed much about his character. Instead of showing remorse or promising to change his behavior, he became defensive and tried to justify his actions. He claimed that Sarah was bringing down unit morale with her appearance and that his comments were just harmless jokes meant to toughen her up. Thompson's response was swift and cutting. He pointed out that Morrison had never served in combat and had no understanding of what Sarah had sacrificed for her country. He explained that true Marines supported their wounded comrades rather than mocking them, and that Morrison's behavior was a disgrace to the uniform he wore. The conversation was witnessed by several other Marines, including some of Morrison's followers who had been wavering in their support. Seeing their leader being dressed down by a respected SEAL veteran was a powerful moment that caused several of them to reconsider their participation in the harassment. Word of the confrontation spread quickly through the base, and opinions began to shift dramatically against Morrison and his remaining supporters. The base community was realizing that the harassment of Sarah was not just isolated cruel behavior, but a serious violation of military values that demanded consequences. Thompson's team continued their campaign throughout the week, using every tool at their disposal to isolate Morrison and protect Sarah. They arranged for Sarah to receive recognition for her technical skills from base leadership, highlighting her contributions to the unit's mission. They also ensured that she was included in professional development opportunities that had previously been denied to her. The SEAL's intervention was having a profound effect on Sarah's daily experience. The harassment didn't stop immediately, but it was clearly diminishing as Morrison lost support from his followers. More importantly, Sarah was beginning to feel supported by a community of warriors who understood and respected her service. By Friday of that week, several of Morrison's former followers had completely distanced themselves from the harassment. Private Brooks had even approached Sarah to apologize for his previous behavior, explaining that he had been influenced by others and promising to treat her with the respect she deserved. The transformation was remarkable, but Thompson and his team knew that their work was far from over. Morrison still had a few dedicated followers, and there was always the possibility that he might try to retaliate against Sarah or the SEALs. The next phase of their operation would need to ensure that the changes they had created would be permanent, and that Sarah would be protected from any future harassment. As Sarah prepared for the weekend, she felt something she hadn't experienced in months: hope. The support of Thompson and his team had shown her that she wasn't alone, and that there were still people in the military who understood what honor and brotherhood truly meant. She was beginning to believe that she could have a successful military career without constantly facing harassment about her appearance. The SEALs had succeeded in turning the tide, but the most dramatic confrontation was still to come. Morrison's behavior was about to escalate in a way that would force the SEAL team to take decisive action and demonstrate once and for all what happened when elite warriors decided to protect one of their own. The weekend had given Morrison time to stew over his confrontation with Master Chief Thompson, and by Monday morning his anger had transformed into something more dangerous: a desire for revenge. Morrison felt his authority and reputation had been challenged by outsiders who had no business interfering in his unit's affairs. In his twisted thinking, Sarah had somehow orchestrated the SEAL intervention to make him look bad. Morrison's remaining loyal followers consisted of 3 Marines: Corporal Danny Riggs, Lance Corporal Steve Walsh, and Private First Class Marcus Dean. These were men who shared Morrison's cruel worldview and had actively participated in the worst aspects of the harassment. Unlike the younger Marines who had been swayed by peer pressure, this core group genuinely enjoyed causing Sarah pain. On Monday morning, Morrison gathered his remaining supporters in a secluded area of the base to plan what he called payback. He was furious about losing face in front of other Marines, and blamed Sarah for bringing outside pressure to bear on his unit. Morrison's plan was to escalate the harassment to a level that would force Sarah to request a transfer or leave the military entirely. The plan Morrison devised revealed the true depths of his cruelty and lack of military bearing. He intended to create a fake emergency scenario that would publicly humiliate Sarah in front of the entire base. Morrison had learned that Sarah suffered from mild anxiety related to her combat trauma, and he planned to exploit this vulnerability in the most sadistic way possible. Morrison's scheme involved triggering the base alarm system during a routine drill, and then staging a mock emergency response that would put Sarah at the center of a chaotic situation designed to overwhelm her. He planned to have his followers film her reaction, hoping to capture footage of her having an anxiety attack that they could then share throughout the base. What Morrison didn't realize was that his planning session had been observed by Petty Officer First Class, retired Alex Rivera, one of Thompson's team members who worked in base maintenance. Rivera had been conducting routine electrical work in the building when he overheard Morrison and his followers discussing their plans. Rivera immediately reported what he had heard to Thompson. Thompson was horrified by the cruelty and sophistication of Morrison's planned attack on Sarah. This went far beyond simple harassment and entered the territory of psychological warfare, designed to exploit combat trauma. The SEAL team realized that they needed to act quickly and decisively to prevent Morrison from carrying out his plan. Thompson called an emergency meeting of his team to develop a response strategy. The 12 SEALs gathered that evening in Thompson's quarters to plan their countermeasures. These were men who had planned complex military operations in hostile territory, and they brought that same level of strategic thinking to protecting Sarah. Chief Chen suggested that they inform base security about Morrison's plan, which would result in immediate disciplinary action. However, Thompson was concerned that Morrison might find a way to retaliate against Sarah before formal charges could be processed. They needed a solution that would neutralize the threat immediately, while also sending a clear message to anyone else who might consider similar behavior. Senior Chief O'Brien proposed a more direct approach. The SEAL team would intercept Morrison's plan and turn it back on him in a way that would publicly demonstrate the consequences of targeting a wounded warrior. The plan they developed was brilliant in its simplicity and would use Morrison's own cruelty against him. The SEALs had learned that Morrison planned to execute his scheme on Wednesday during the weekly base-wide emergency drill. This gave them 2 days to prepare their countermeasures, and ensure that Sarah would be protected from Morrison's psychological attack. Thompson met with Sarah on Tuesday morning to warn her about Morrison's plan without revealing all the details of how they had learned about it. He explained that Morrison was planning to escalate his harassment, and that she should be prepared for something more serious than the usual verbal abuse. Sarah was grateful for the warning but concerned about what Morrison might be planning. The SEAL team's plan required careful coordination and split-second timing. They would allow Morrison to begin his scheme but then intervene at precisely the right moment to turn the situation to their advantage. Each team member had a specific role to play, and they rehearsed their intervention multiple times to ensure flawless execution. Chief Sanchez was tasked with documenting Morrison's behavior on video, ensuring that there would be irrefutable evidence of his attempt to psychologically torment Sarah. Petty Officer Martinez would coordinate with base security to ensure that Morrison's actions would result in immediate disciplinary consequences. The other team members would position themselves strategically around the area where Morrison planned to stage his fake emergency. Wednesday morning arrived with typical California sunshine, but there was tension in the air as both sides prepared for their respective operations. Morrison and his followers were excited about their plan, believing they were about to achieve the ultimate humiliation of Sarah. Meanwhile, the SEAL team was positioned and ready to turn Morrison's cruelty back on him. The base-wide emergency drill began at 1,000 hours, as scheduled. Morrison had arranged to trigger a false alarm in the communications building where Sarah worked, creating confusion and panic that he planned to amplify through his staged emergency response. As the alarms began to sound, Morrison put his plan into motion. Morrison and his followers rushed into the communications center, shouting about a gas leak and demanding that everyone evacuate immediately. In the confusion, they began directing their verbal assault specifically at Sarah, claiming that her monstrous appearance was causing additional panic among the evacuating personnel. Sarah recognized immediately that this was not a real emergency but rather an elaborate harassment scheme. Despite her anxiety about the chaotic situation, she maintained her composure and began following proper evacuation procedures. She refused to give Morrison and his followers the satisfaction of seeing her break under their psychological assault. What Morrison didn't realize was that his every move was being recorded by Chief Sanchez, who had positioned himself with a clear view of the communications center. The video would show Morrison deliberately targeting Sarah during what he believed was an emergency situation, behavior that would be considered a serious violation of military conduct. As Morrison's fake emergency reached its crescendo, Thompson and his team moved into action. The 12 SEALs appeared seemingly from nowhere, surrounding Morrison and his followers in the evacuation area. Their presence was so sudden and overwhelming that Morrison's group was caught completely off guard. Thompson stepped forward and calmly announced that the emergency was over and that everyone could return to their duties. His authoritative presence and obvious command-bearing caused the confused Marines and other personnel to immediately settle down. Morrison found himself face-to-face with 12 of the most elite warriors on the base, all of whom were clearly displeased with his behavior. The confrontation that followed was swift and decisive. Thompson addressed Morrison in a voice that carried across the entire area, ensuring that every Marine present could hear his words. He explained that Morrison had just been caught staging a fake emergency for the purpose of harassing a wounded combat veteran, behavior that was disgraceful and unworthy of any Marine. Morrison tried to defend himself, claiming that he was just conducting an unauthorized drill to test unit readiness. But Thompson was prepared for this excuse and had Chief Sanchez step forward with the video evidence showing Morrison's deliberate targeting of Sarah during the supposed emergency. The footage was damning, clearly showing Morrison using military emergency procedures as a weapon against a fellow Marine. There could be no legitimate explanation for his behavior, and every Marine watching realized that they had just witnessed something that went against everything their service was supposed to represent. Captain Hayes arrived on the scene within minutes, having been alerted by Petty Officer Martinez. When he saw the video evidence and heard testimonies from multiple witnesses, he immediately placed Morrison under arrest pending a formal investigation. Morrison's followers were also detained for questioning about their role in the incident. The impact on the gathered Marines was profound and immediate. Many of them had been aware of the harassment Sarah was enduring, but had done nothing to stop it. Seeing Morrison's behavior exposed in such a public and dramatic fashion forced them to confront their own complicity in allowing the harassment to continue. Sarah watched the confrontation unfold with a mixture of emotions. She felt vindicated to see Morrison finally facing consequences for his actions, but she was also amazed by the coordinated response of the SEAL team. These men had put their own reputations on the line to protect her, demonstrating a level of brotherhood that she hadn't expected to find in her military career. The immediate aftermath of Morrison's arrest created a buzz of conversation throughout the base. Marines who had remained silent during months of harassment were now speaking up to condemn Morrison's behavior and express support for Sarah. The SEAL intervention had created a shift in the base culture that made such harassment unacceptable. Thompson approached Sarah after Morrison had been taken away by security. He wanted to make sure she was okay and to let her know that his team would continue to support her through whatever legal proceedings might follow. Sarah was grateful for his concern, but also impressed by the professionalism the SEALs had shown throughout their intervention. The news of Morrison's arrest spread quickly through military channels, and by evening, senior officers from throughout the base were calling for a comprehensive review of harassment policies and procedures. Morrison's behavior had exposed systemic problems that could no longer be ignored or covered up. Colonel Williams called Thompson to her office that afternoon to discuss the incident. She praised the SEAL team for their professional handling of the situation and their dedication to protecting a fellow service member. She also announced that Morrison would face court-martial proceedings and that his followers would receive appropriate disciplinary action. The colonel also implemented immediate changes to address the culture that had allowed Morrison's harassment to flourish. She ordered mandatory training on respect for wounded warriors and established new reporting procedures to ensure that future harassment would be quickly identified and stopped. As Sarah prepared to leave work that evening, she was approached by several Marines who wanted to apologize for their previous silence and to express their support for her continued service. The dramatic confrontation with Morrison had awakened many consciences and created a more supportive environment for her to work in. The SEAL team's intervention had achieved everything they had hoped for and more. They had not only stopped Morrison's harassment, but had also created lasting changes in the base culture that would protect Sarah and other potential victims in the future. Their actions had demonstrated the true meaning of military brotherhood and the obligations that warriors have to protect each other. However, the story was far from over. The legal proceedings against Morrison would take time to resolve, and there was still work to be done to ensure that the positive changes created by the SEAL intervention would become permanent fixtures of the base culture. The weeks following Morrison's arrest marked a transformation period for Camp Pendleton that extended far beyond just stopping one Marine's harassment campaign. Sarah found herself at the center of a movement that was changing how the entire base approached the treatment of wounded warriors and the culture of mutual support that should define military service. Colonel Williams had ordered a comprehensive investigation into Morrison's behavior that uncovered a disturbing pattern of harassment that had been ignored or minimized by previous commanders. The investigation revealed that Morrison had targeted at least 4 other service members over his 15-year career, including a Navy corpsman who had been wounded in Iraq and a female Marine who had reported sexual harassment. The evidence gathered during the investigation painted a picture of a toxic leader who had been allowed to abuse his authority for years because his superiors had chosen to overlook his behavior rather than address it. Morrison's personnel file contained multiple informal complaints that had been dismissed as personality conflicts or minor disciplinary issues. Master Chief Thompson and his team were called to testify about their observations and intervention. Their testimony provided crucial evidence about Morrison's systematic harassment of Sarah and his deliberate attempt to exploit her combat-related trauma. The SEALs' professional handling of the situation and their detailed documentation of Morrison's behavior impressed the investigating officers. Sarah's testimony was particularly powerful. She described months of escalating harassment and the psychological impact it had on her ability to perform her duties and maintain her emotional well-being. Her calm, professional demeanor and clear articulation of the facts made it impossible for anyone to dismiss her experience as oversensitivity or misunderstanding. The court-martial proceedings became a teaching moment for the entire base. Senior officers used Morrison's case as an example of behavior that would no longer be tolerated and the serious consequences that would follow for anyone who targeted wounded warriors or engaged in systematic harassment. Morrison was ultimately convicted of multiple charges including harassment of a subordinate, conduct unbecoming a Marine, and abuse of authority. He was sentenced to reduction in rank, forfeiture of pay, and dismissal from the Marine Corps. His military career was over, and he would receive a discharge that would follow him for the rest of his life. The 3 Marines who had actively participated in Morrison's harassment campaign also faced consequences. Corporal Riggs and Lance Corporal Walsh were court-martialed and received reductions in rank along with significant restrictions and additional duties. Private First Class Dean, who was identified as the least culpable of the group, received non-judicial punishment but was allowed to remain in the Marines with the understanding that any future misconduct would result in immediate discharge. The young Marines who had distanced themselves from Morrison after the SEAL intervention were handled differently. Private Brooks and 2 others received counseling and additional training on military values and the treatment of wounded warriors. Their commanders recognized that these Marines had been influenced by poor leadership and could be reformed through proper guidance. The broader impact of the case extended throughout the Marine Corps. Morrison's court-martial became a case study used in leadership schools to teach about the importance of maintaining unit cohesion and the obligations that leaders have to protect their subordinates. The case was cited in new policies and training programs designed to prevent similar harassment in the future. Sarah's experience during this period was transformative. The support she received from the SEAL team and the base leadership helped her regain confidence in herself and in the military system. She began speaking at training sessions about her experiences, helping other service members understand the impact of harassment on wounded warriors. Thompson and his team continued to maintain a protective presence around Sarah, but their role gradually evolved from active intervention to mentorship and support. They helped her navigate the legal proceedings and provided guidance as she considered her future military career options. The SEAL team's actions had created a ripple effect throughout the base that extended far beyond Sarah's individual situation. Other Marines who had been subjected to harassment or discrimination found the courage to come forward with their own complaints. The cultural shift created by the Morrison case made it clear that such behavior would be taken seriously and addressed quickly. Colonel Williams implemented a comprehensive program to prevent future harassment that included regular training, clear reporting procedures, and accountability measures for leaders at all levels. She established a victim advocate program and created anonymous reporting systems that made it easier for service members to report misconduct without fear of retaliation. The colonel also recognized the SEAL team's exceptional service with a formal commendation that praised their professionalism, integrity, and commitment to protecting a fellow warrior. The commendation became part of their permanent records and served as recognition of their willingness to stand up for what was right. Sarah's career began to flourish in the new environment created by these changes. She was selected for advanced technical training and received recognition for her professional accomplishments. Her supervisors praised her dedication and expertise, noting that she had maintained exceptional performance standards even while dealing with the stress of harassment. 6 months after Morrison's court-martial, Sarah was promoted to sergeant and received orders to attend the Advanced Communication School. The promotion represented not just recognition of her technical skills, but also acknowledgement of her perseverance and character in the face of adversity. The day before Sarah's departure for her new assignment, Thompson and his team organized a farewell gathering that included Marines from throughout the base. The event was a celebration of Sarah's achievements and a demonstration of the supportive community that had emerged from the Morrison incident. During the gathering, several Marines spoke about how the SEAL intervention had changed their own perspective on military service and their obligations to their fellow warriors. Young Marines who had previously remained silent during harassment incidents described how they had learned to speak up and intervene when they witnessed misconduct. Sarah's speech at the farewell gathering was emotional and inspiring. She thanked Thompson and his team for their support, but emphasized that their intervention had done more than just protect her. They had demonstrated what true military brotherhood looked like, and had shown everyone on the base that wounded warriors deserved respect and support rather than mockery. Thompson's response was characteristically humble. He reminded everyone that protecting fellow service members was not extraordinary behavior, but simply what warriors should do for each other. He emphasized that the real heroes were people like Sarah who continued to serve despite facing adversity and challenges. The impact of the SEAL intervention continued to resonate long after Sarah's departure. The base became known throughout the Marine Corps as a model for how to properly support wounded warriors and maintain a culture of mutual respect. Other installations began implementing similar programs based on the policies developed at Camp Pendleton. Thompson and his team received requests to speak at other military installations about their intervention and the lessons learned from the Morrison case. They used these opportunities to spread the message that elite warriors have special obligations to protect and support their fellow service members, especially those who have been wounded in service to their country. The 12 SEALs had proven that a small group of dedicated warriors could create lasting change by standing up for what was right. Their intervention had transformed not just Sarah's individual experience, but the entire culture of a military installation. They had demonstrated that true strength comes from protecting those who cannot protect themselves, and that honor requires action, not just words. Sarah's new assignment at the Advanced Communications School was a success, and she graduated at the top of her class. Her instructors were impressed by her technical skills and her leadership potential. She was selected for additional specialized training and began preparing for advancement to senior enlisted ranks. 2 years after the Morrison incident, Sarah returned to Camp Pendleton as a staff sergeant and instructor at the communications school. Her return was greeted with enthusiasm by Marines throughout the base who remembered her case and the positive changes it had created. Sarah's new role allowed her to mentor other wounded warriors and help them navigate the challenges of military service after injury. She used her own experience to help others understand that their scars represented service and sacrifice rather than weakness or failure. The legacy of Thompson's team continued to influence the base culture. New Marines arriving at Camp Pendleton were briefed on the importance of supporting wounded warriors and the expectations for maintaining unit cohesion and mutual respect. The Morrison case remained a powerful example of the consequences of harassment and the rewards of standing up for fellow service members. Sarah eventually made the decision to extend her military service beyond her initial commitment. The support she had received and the positive environment created by the SEAL intervention had restored her faith in the military and her desire to continue serving her country. She set her sights on becoming a senior enlisted leader and continuing the cycle of protecting and mentoring other service members. Thompson and his team remained in contact with Sarah throughout her career, serving as mentors and friends who continued to support her professional development. Their intervention had created bonds that would last long after their military service ended. The story of the 12 SEAL veterans who stood up for Sarah Martinez became legendary within military circles. It was told in leadership schools, written about in military publications, and referenced in policy documents as an example of the best traditions of military service. Years later, when Thompson was asked about the most important mission he had ever completed, he would point to the intervention on behalf of Sarah. He would explain that protecting a wounded warrior from harassment had been more meaningful than any combat operation, because it had represented the true purpose of military service, protecting those who cannot protect themselves. The transformation that began with one Marine's harassment of a wounded warrior had become a model for how military communities should function. The 12 SEAL veterans had proven that a few dedicated warriors could change an entire culture and create lasting positive impact through their willingness to stand up for what was right. Sarah's scars, which had once been objects of ridicule, became symbols of service and sacrifice that inspired others to treat wounded warriors with the respect they deserved. The harassment that was meant to drive her from military service had instead strengthened her resolve and created positive changes that would benefit countless other service members. The story served as a powerful reminder that true warriors protect the vulnerable, and that honor requires action in the face of injustice. The 12 SEAL veterans had demonstrated these values in the most meaningful way possible, creating a legacy that would inspire future generations of military leaders to stand up for their fellow warriors when it mattered most.